Hallo, dear listeners. Welcome to the Zeitgeist podcast. I'm your host, Katja Heuer, a German British historian and journalist. And in each episode, I invite one guest on to join me to talk about issues that are, well, more or less related to Germany. Today, I'm pleased to say that I have Dr. Marcel Dirsus with me. Marcel is a political scientist focusing on regime instability, political violence, and German foreign policy. Nice combination there. He writes a newsletter called The 100 on Substack. He's a non resident fellow at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University in Germany and a member of the Standing Expert Committee Terrorism and Interior Security at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. He also advises an impressive amount of international organizations such as NATO and the OECD. So I'm very, very glad to have him here. Welcome, Marcel.
Thank you very much for having me.
Marcel, the thing that intrigues me most about your CV is that there's not only a huge amount of impressive stuff about, advising supranational institutions and working with academic places and think tanks, but it's also laced with, shall we say, less common entries, such as he worked for a brewery in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Before we talk about your book, can you tell us a little bit more about this particular episode in your life? How did that come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was definitely an interesting time. So the way that came about is that I originally went to school in Germany. Then I was in the UK to learn English, and because I always wanted to be a diplomat. And then while I was at uni, I did an internship at the German Foreign Office, and I was not amazed. So I kept studying, and then eventually, I figured because I had all that tuition fee debt from the UK that I'd go and do something rather boring with my life for a couple of years. Maybe something like investment banking or something along those lines, which was not particularly exciting to me. But I thought, okay, I'll do it. But so I figured before I do that kind of thing to pay back my tuition fees, I would try to see the world a little bit. So I applied for a couple of places and, asked people whether they could find something for me, perhaps. And in the end, I was offered that job in the DRC. So I was like, okay, I mean, it's not like I'm going to go at any other point in my life, right?
Fair enough.
So I figured I'd go, and it was extremely interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine. Did you have any particular adventures there that you'd care to relay?
I mean, quite a few. I think, it's my first time, living and working in Africa. So I think, the Congo was probably a pretty adventurous introduction, so to speak. And I was amazed with quite a lot of things. I mean, first of all, the people were super, super friendly, which I know might be a bit of a cliche, but genuinely so welcoming and so warm-hearted and so forth. So that was great. And obviously things were very, very different to what I had seen before. So everything was exciting, like wherever you go, whatever you see, whether it's, birds or trees or, music, everything was super exciting. So that was amazing. But then, obviously not everything was easy. And, a lot of the stuff on the ground didn't really work. And that made it quite difficult, I think, to like navigate also in a work context, because if you work, generally you try to get things done, right? And doing that is quite difficult when you can't rely on the things that you've taken for granted. So, perhaps there's no internet, or, when it rains, perhaps you've got the roof leaking and, those kind of things. So it was an adventure.
Yeah, I can imagine in terms of work culture as well. I worked in Malaysia for a little while, and I got quite frustrated with my German mindset that people didn't turn up on time, and sometimes things took a little bit longer than, than I expected them to. But it's also fun. It kind of breaks up your own sureties and certainties in a way as well. I think it's fair to say that adventure and maybe a willingness to think and work outside the box still play a kind of role in your life as a political scientist, right? So how does that sort of thing shape you in your work?
I mean, I think there's this like cliche of academics being stuck in sort of the ivory tower and only reading papers and, not really having much access to the quote unquote normal world. But I mean, that's a cliche for a reason, right? I think a lot of academia can be like that. And I definitely, after that experience, I didn't want my work to be like that. I wanted to be applicable to sort of the real world. And I also wanted to be accessible to people. So, and that was also part of the aim of this book, to sort of get people thinking about these topics that might not get paid to think about politics all day, right? So I think, yeah, it had a big impact and sort of is one of the guiding principles of what I try to do. And also, I mean, again, this is a cliche, but life is really short, you know? So I think you, if you think something is fun and something is interesting, you know, like I want to go after it and try to see whether I can make it happen.
Yeah, no, I think that really comes through in your book. So let's talk about this book, as we've mentioned it twice. So your debut book is called How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, which will be out in the UK on the 18th of July. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book? So what is it actually about, and what did you want to achieve with it?
Yeah, sure. So the title is pretty accurate, How Tyrants Fall. So essentially it is about the way that some of the most powerful, but also some of the most terrifying rulers on earth lose their power. So it's a book that's about revolutions, it's about, you know, mass uprisings, it's about coups, it's about assassinations, a lot of these grim but you know, very consequential events in human history. So really the inspiration behind the book, I guess, was twofold. One, you know, you look around the world and you see all these you know, dictators running rampant, essentially, you know, wreaking chaos, and you know, whether it be starting wars or assassinating people and so forth. So the first angle to the book is basically that. So you know, the very simple question, okay, how might somebody like Putin fall? You know, how could we maybe weaken somebody like Xi Jinping? You know, how are the theocrats and, you know, Iran trying to stay in power, and what might they be doing to structure the military in a certain way and so forth? So that's the first angle. And then the second angle is, obviously tyranny is not just something that happens over there, right? It's also something that could come home, so to speak, because over the last couple of years or maybe decade, there was obviously a lot of discussion about the way that democracies die, and you know, what is going to happen to the big democracies in Europe, you know, across the pond in the United States. Seems like a very acute question at the moment. So the second angle to the book is really that, you know, so if our democracies were to die, what would happen and how might we prepare, and what can we expect afterwards, essentially.
So really it's almost practical practical guide, but we get to that in a minute, as well, what we can do to bring those down, those dictators. In the first instance, I thought, you know, there's a bit of a paradox here, right? I mean, dictators uphold their power through a combination of incentives, propaganda, force, coercion, and so on. They should sit more firmly in the saddle than democratic governments, because ultimately that's their aim, because ultimately democracies can be ousted when the people change their minds. And yet you argue that dictators are in constant danger. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think in the West we often have this idea that our systems are uniquely dysfunctional, and you know, we look at places like China, and we look at also to an extent Russia, and we think, oh my God, you know, this is like strong leaders, and they get things done, and they're so firmly in the saddle, and they definitely know what they're doing. And that's a myth. You know, obviously our systems are dysfunctional, clearly, right? But that's not to imply that the other systems work any better. And I would argue they are much worse. And part of the reason is because in democracies, you have a risk, obviously, if you're a politician and there's a lot of polarization and so forth. But generally speaking, you are much, much safer being a democratic politician than you are being a tyrant, being a dictator. And the reason for that is that obviously, I mean, there's no rule of law in these systems, but also to maintain power in these systems, you have to do a lot of bad things, right? You have to be corrupt. You have to harass your opponents. You have to make their life miserable. So you make a lot of enemies, and you do things that are illegal all the time. So when you do happen to lose power, oftentimes it's in a way that is violent and directly threatening. So you might be assassinated, or you might be killed in a coup. But even if you survive the transition of power itself, there's a very high risk that you're going to be sent into exile, you're going to end up in a jail cell, or you're going to be killed. And my argument is that a lot of what these tyrants do, what these dictators do, goes back to that, because obviously, you know, everybody wants to survive. So in order to
Mm.
survive, they do a lot of things that then end up hurting them down the road, because they just want to survive today, and they can't really think about what happens in a year or two, and that's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's also what drives them, perhaps arguably, into some of the more extreme things that people do. And yet, some dictators are able to stay in power for such a long time. over decades sometimes. So is it just the circumstances from the ones that you've studied, or are they doing something right, for lack of a better word? What distinguishes the ones that stay in power from those that don't?
It's a bit of both, I think. I'm always reluctant to sort of use the word right or, use the
Me
word
too.
successful and so forth. But so just for the listeners, when we say like they're doing something right, we're not saying that it's moral. We're saying that they're doing something that is effective to achieve their aim of staying in power and staying alive, right? Same when we say something, oh, this or that tyrant is, successful, so to speak. But yeah, I think obviously there are a lot of things that dictators can do in order to stay in power. So the primary threat to most of these dictators are the people closest to them, right? It's not usually the masses. It's not usually the people that are far away, but it's in the book I think I put it something like the people smiling at them as they sort of walk along the corridor, right? Those people are most likely to stab them in the back, and the reason why that is because these systems are almost like a pyramid where at the bottom people have very little power and at the top, right, like at the apex, people have all the power. So the people that are closest to the power also have the most opportunity to get rid of the dictator, which is also why coups, for example, are extremely dangerous, and why sort of like palace intrigue is also extremely dangerous, because these are the people that really matter in these regimes, and that's also why they can get rid of the tyrants if they sort of misstep. So the main job of dictators is to manage those people. And to simplify it a little bit, they basically have two tools to do this. They can either sort of incentivize the right, quote unquote, right behavior, right, which is sticking to them and supporting them, or they can punish behavior that is not in their interest, right? So they can purge people, they can throw people into jail, and so forth. But in actuality, both of those things are kind of difficult, and it's very difficult to find a balance between the two as well. So if you just look at purging, for example, it makes sense if, let's say, there was an assassination attempt and it's very obvious to everybody that somebody in the lead tried to kill the dictator. If you then purge that person, the sort of other, let's say, ministers sitting around a cabinet table might say, well, okay, it is what it is. He tried to kill the big man, so now he gets killed. But if you go overboard, right, you get into a situation where sort of the people around the table start to sweat a little bit and they think, oh my God, person after person is being purged. I might be next. And if you have that, then the other people around the table that are not getting purged right now might think to themselves, oh God, if I don't make a move now, if I don't get together with these other people, we could be purged next. We could end up being thrown into jail or end up being killed. So everything that you do as a dictator to stay in power basically creates more problems for you. But also, obviously, there's luck. A lot of these people have been very, very close to getting killed, or getting deposed and perhaps then getting killed, but they just made it through fluke, basically, right? So maybe like a bomb didn't explode because it was too cold on a plane, or maybe like a courier didn't get through, that kind of thing. It also happens. So yeah, it's a bit of both. I think there's a lot that you can do to maximize your chances of staying in power, but at the end of the day, you also need luck.
Yeah, absolutely. And the circumstances, even in terms of your own popular support, maybe with the people as well, have got to be right. And that brings us actually to my next question. So another threat to dictators, apart from their internal circle, actually comes from the people themselves, and you describe that in various examples in the book. Particularly popular uprisings, which you say are responsible for 17%. I find that figure fascinating as well. 17% of dictatorships are brought down by popular uprising, which seems quite a lot actually. So we are kind of used to the idea that dictators just suppress uprisings, right? So either through surveillance in the build-up, where they identify kind of the troublemakers, for lack of a better word, or by actually shooting at protesters once the demonstrations or whatever are underway. So why are you describing uprisings as a sort of quite real dilemma for the dictators? Can't they just roll in the tanks every time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, like you say, it's not the main threat perhaps, but as you say, the number is quite large, and it's quite large, especially given the amount of attention that these people pay to preventing it, right? Because they're obsessed with it. I mean, like all of these people, whether it's Putin, whether it's Xi and so forth, they are obsessed with the idea of, the masses erupting and, I don't know, color revolutions instigated by the CIA and so
Mm.
forth, right? Like I mean, it generally keeps them up at night. So given how much attention they pay to it, it's definitely remarkable. And the reason why they just can't just bring in the tanks all the time is the way that popular protest works. So the way that, because it's a curious thing, right? I mean, you have these super powerful regimes, you have these leaders, surrounded by, the soldiers with the bayonets and so forth, and then they are being brought down by peaceful protest. I mean, it's a weird thing, right? At first. But so the mechanism by which this works is because they use a weakness of these dictatorial regimes. And the first weakness that they have is that they cannot just allow protests against the government, right? So if you're a democratic leader, if you're, I don't know, Olaf Scholz or like Rishi Sunak or something like that, yeah, you might be annoyed when people protest against you, but it's not a threat to your well-being. It's not going to bring down sort of the way that the entire country works. But for dictators, it's different. They have to project strength and they have to almost project invincibility because it's all a mirage. So they basically ban these protests. And when they then happen anyway, the problem for them is that protests can grow very, very, very quickly. And the reason for that is something called a participation advantage, which is essentially to say that it is easy for people to participate. So if somebody asked the two of us, for example, to take part in a rebellion, like in a jungle somewhere, we would probably say no, or at least I probably would, because I'm probably not good at guerrilla warfare. And also it doesn't sound very pleasant. And there seems to be a high chance of getting killed or dying to some illness. But going out to a protest is very easy. You could have pensioners going to a protest. You could have people going to a protest that have never held a gun. So these kind of events can very quickly get out of control from the dictator's perspective, simply because there are so many people present. And once you have a lot of people present, you then have the exact problem that you have described. Do you send in the tanks? Do you shoot these people? Do you at least beat them up? Or, what on earth do you do? Because the problem is, if you do decide to beat them up, or if you do decide to shoot at them, there's a massive risk of a backlash, especially if the protesting is peaceful. Because obviously, across cultures, the idea of shooting, unarmed, women, perhaps even children or, pensioners is outrageous. So you might end up in a situation where you give the order to shoot, and then the next day you simply have more people in the street because everybody's so angered and they figure, okay, this regime really has to go. But in a way, something else can happen, and that is almost worse. Because obviously, just because you have the tanks and because you have the people with the guns doesn't mean they actually get fired. You need somebody to, fire the weapons. So the worst possible thing that you can do almost is to give an order to shoot, and then your security forces simply refuse. Because then you have a situation where not only you wanted them to shoot, so people are going to be upset, but you're no longer even in control of your security apparatus. And when you're no longer in control of your security apparatus, you're done, basically, right? Because this goes back to sort of coups being the primary problem with the palace intrigue and so forth. So you cannot, under any circumstance, afford to lose the men with guns. And, to them, obviously, I mean, if I know we're maybe going to talk about Germany later, but let's say you're put in a situation where you're, I don't know, like a 22-year-old or something, you just have this gun, you've been trained to, defend the country, maybe in your imagination, you could become a hero or something like that. And then you're given an order to shoot these unarmed people. I mean, it's not an attractive scenario, right? Even morals aside, because what if you shoot them and then the regime falls anyway? So the moment at which dictators don't use these guns as sort of a symbol of control, but they try to use it to actually control their population, they become brittle. It's extremely risky. And this is something that peaceful protesters can make use of because they know that there's often a way to split the regime. Because some of the people in the regime are not going to go along with it. Some will. But if you manage to just pry it open a little bit, you have this window of opportunity. And that's how regimes can fall.
Yeah, and you already mentioned Germany, so let's get to it as this is a Germany-related podcast in theory, at least. Yeah, I mean, you look quite closely at some of the people who bring down dictatorships, and one example that I found fascinating, maybe with my East Germany hat on, is a man that you actually met during your research, called Siegberg Schäfke, who was an East German dissident, whom the Stasi was, by your account, sort of terrified of, and called him they called him Satan in the in the sort of files. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and what you discussed with him and what role he played in the downbringing of the East German regime?
Yeah, so I mean, when I started writing the book, I figured I didn't just want to read papers or other academics' books because, first of all, it didn't sound that fun, but also it seemed more informative to actually try to talk to some of the people that were present, right? So I tried to talk to, sort of activists, human rights defenders, dissidents, people in the military and so forth. And when I was looking at the GDR, I mean, first of all, the case, so to speak, itself was fascinating to me because this is exactly one of those scenarios where a regime is being brought down, at least in large part, because of a peaceful protest. But also, obviously, being German myself, it felt different than a lot of the other cases. I'm interested in Uganda as well, and I'm interested in, Paraguay and China. But obviously, being German, learning about Germany, writing about Germany is different, right? As you as you know.
Indeed.
So that kind of attracted me to the topic, and then I reached out to them and drove down to Leipzig and met him. A really fascinating man. So like you say, he was an opponent of the regime. And they made his life very difficult. It was not pleasant, obviously, to be an opponent of the regime if the Stasi had you sort of on their radar. So basically, they harassed him. There was like all these interrogation sessions and so forth. He ended up losing his job and so forth. But in actuality, sort of that harassment didn't make him back down. It had the opposite effect. It was like that backlash that we just described with the public protest, but at an individual level. So when he lost his job because of his political activities, he just became a full-time revolutionary, basically. So it was like the opposite of the intended effect. And his contribution to all this is that he was something of a citizen journalist, essentially. And when he knew that a big protest was planned in Leipzig in the autumn of 1989, he sort of shook off the Stasi agents that were sort of observing his every move. And once he'd got rid of them and he left Berlin, he went to Leipzig. And his aim was to film the protest. He wanted to film the protest, and he then wanted to disseminate it to make sure that everybody would know about it. And as you can imagine, that was quite the struggle because Leipzig was full of security forces. I mean, the Stasi was there, the military was there were a lot of policemen there. So the city was just crawling with the security apparatus of the GDR. But in the end, even though he was very desperate, he found a place with his friend at the time from which to film. And the way it worked is that he actually ended up asking a pastor whether they could go up on the bell tower of the church. And when they asked, there was some hesitation on the part of the pastor, but eventually he said, okay, you can go up. So he went up. And even though it was probably not what he had imagined when he first started driving to Leipzig, he had a great view. And eventually he managed to film the protest. And after the tape was then smuggled, because back in the day, obviously, you couldn't just there was no cloud storage, so there was no way to transmit it over the internet. But after the tape of it was smuggled, it was actually aired on West German TV, which was a major achievement because obviously at the time, a lot of people in East Germany were able to watch West German television. So it was partly because of him that other people in the East even found out about the whole thing.
Yeah, that's one of those key moments really where you kind of gather momentum, I guess, and the sort of actions of individuals are driving a wider sort of protest forward. And it's those sort of very practical things that are, kind of throughout your book, an interesting part of the sort of how-to guide of bringing down dictatorships. Before we get to the actual how-to, can we briefly discuss whether it's actually always a good idea to topple dictatorships? Maybe from a moral point of view, but from a Western point of view, it seems obvious that everyone would be better off in democracies. But regime change can also often bring chaos and danger actually to the populations that are in that system. So can dictatorships ever really be better for a population than the alternative? Is something that you hear quite a lot when, particularly Western intervention happens in, say, the Middle East and elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic, and one that I also struggled with while I was writing the book. Everybody deserves to live in freedom, right? I think everybody deserves to live in a democracy. Everyone deserves to have, freedom of speech, the rule of law, and those stuff. So I think, generally speaking, that is something that Western liberal democracies should promote. The question then, though, is how, right? And how do you manage the trade-off between wanting to promote democracy and, achieving your other aims, right? Or dealing with your other interests. And that, of course, is extremely difficult in the real world. When you look at the numbers, as I tried to do, to sort of be, as analytical as possible, foreign imposed regime change, so the idea of going in by force and then changing a government, the numbers are terrible. I mean, if you look at the overall track record of doing it, it is not encouraging, and that's putting it in very diplomatic terms. So I am extremely skeptical, generally speaking, of using force to change governments and to try to turn them into democracies. One, because the track record is bad. Two, because I think, like you say, there's a moral question here, right? So people might want to be rid of the dictator that suppresses them, but it is something different for us to impose a new government on them rather than them doing it themselves. So that's the second reason. And then the third reason, a lot of times it is extremely costly, right? So, I mean, and when I'm saying costly, I don't just mean costly for us, which is obviously true. I mean, if you go to war, you're going to sort of pay in both blood and in treasure, but also it's extremely costly for the people on the ground, right? So if you look at something like Iraq, Saddam Hussein was clearly terrible and he should have been toppled. But the way that we contributed to toppling him killed a lot of people. So generally speaking, I'm extremely skeptical. But then again, being German, it is difficult for me to argue that there should never be a point at which outside powers should use force to try to topple a tyrant. So I am somewhere on that spectrum. I looked at some cases in which it has worked, and those are encouraging. But yeah, I think you have to look at every case and make up your mind in that moment, which of course, again, is extremely difficult to do. Because imagine you have to make that call, right? Like imagine you wake up, you get your briefing by your intel services saying this and that dictator is going to barrel bomb markets today. He's going to kill an untold number of civilians. How do you do, right? I mean, first of all, you're not going to read academic papers to look at what the historical track record is like. And even if you do, in that moment when you actually have to make that call, you're under the impression of the information you've just received, I wouldn't want to be the person deciding that, because it's a decision in which you can only really lose.
And kind of just leaning into that, how do you explain, or have you got an explanation for the fact that so many people around the world seem to be drawn towards more autocratic rule, and kind of even sometimes when those decisions are put in front of them in say a plebiscite or a referendum or something, in some areas of the world, basically people give more power to the rulers and seem to kind of reject Western style democracy. Have you got an explanation for that? So why are dictatorships sometimes appealing to people?
I mean, I should note that this is not my area of expertise, but my hunch is that a lot of people look at Western democracies and they see paralysis. They think nothing gets done, essentially, right? So they see that maybe the roads don't get built, or it takes a decade to build a hospital, or this doesn't work, that doesn't work, and so forth. And I think what is very appealing about, let's say, a system like communist China is that things do get done, right? I mean, they can build airports and they can build roads, and the system is, in that sense, effective. But obviously, that effectiveness comes at a huge cost. And I think we don't pay enough attention to that cost. Like I said, I think a lot of people have this image of these omnipotent rulers that sort of snap their fingers and boom, new port, boom, new airport, and so forth. And obviously, there's way more to it than that. But I think the other things are easier to ignore. So I would say it's a combination of Western liberal democracies are just not very good at delivering for their citizens, it seems to me. And at the same time, we have perhaps an unrealistic image of some of the alternatives.
Okay, let's go to the how-to then, which is sort of the core of your book. Have you got any top tips for us then, and for anyone really trying to topple a dictator?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I have some ideas. It's sort of it really depends, what kind of system you're dealing with and how much you're willing to spend in terms of resources to get it done. So there are a lot of systems of government that are non-democratic, but that are very much do not look like Xi Jinping's China or look like Putin's Russia. So these are kind of outliers. The vast majority of these systems are not very stable. Leaders change fairly frequently, and it is rather chaotic. So when you look at those kind of systems, there's often a genuine possibility to make a difference and make a difference in a way that is not too costly to Western liberal democracies. So yeah, I mean, you can support journalists, you can support dissidents, you can grant them exile, you can train people, you can, contribute to the free flow of information, you can sanction key officials, and all those kinds of things. All that is possible. Most of the time, it's not very expensive, and it can make a genuine difference. It's not going to topple these regimes straight away, but it will give the people a better fighting chance, so to speak, when a moment of instability arises. The harder case, though, are places like Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China or Iran or Kim Jong-un and so forth. And for those types of regimes, the difficulty that we run into is that what would be most effective at toppling them is very expensive for us to do. In some cases, extremely expensive. I mean, talking like possibility for nuclear war type expensive.
Mm.
And also the outcome that we would be looking at is generally not that great, because a lot of these things would include violence, right? I mean, like if you really, really, really wanted to damage, a regime like Putin's Russia, you wouldn't just impose sanctions the way that we have, but the sanction would be absolutely crippling. We would support, dissidents not just to, I don't know, post on Telegram or something like that, but we would encourage them to carry out sabotage. We'd have people bombing pipelines, basically. If there's an assassin looking for a safe house, we would provide it. That type of thing. Obviously, that would make life much harder for people in Moscow, but we are very reluctant to do that because, again, the potential cost of that would be massive, right? So we have this difficulty, basically. How do we sort of balance danger? How do we balance what we're willing to expend? And how badly do we want these people to fall? And also, I mean, the question, is it enough for them to fall? Because that's a debate when you sort of talk about the outcomes, right?
Mm.
So peaceful protest, when you look purely at the outcome of what happens afterwards, is the best. You're most likely to have a, sort of a stable liberal democracy after a peaceful protest in comparison to, let's say, a coup d'etat. But perhaps sometimes that's not even what you need. I mean, there are some people who argue that to get rid of Putin, we wouldn't even need to have a high probability of getting a democracy afterwards. Perhaps it's just enough to get rid of that guy. And then with the next guy, even though he is probably also going to be a dictator, we can sort of reestablish some guardrails so we can get along in some civilized way. So it's extremely difficult. There are many, many ways of looking at it, and it's very challenging.
And a lot of these ways are in your fantastic book. And what struck me really about it is that it's full of very original, I found, observations and captivating insights that I hadn't seen in this form kind of before in other places. But getting to these insights wasn't always straightforward, was it? You write on your blog, on your website, that you quote spoke to revolutionaries, coup plotters, rebels, diplomats, and soldiers, in addition to drawing on mountains of research. And you say it was quite a journey, that one day you'd be speaking to an expert on Caligula, and the next day you'd be on a WhatsApp call with a politician from Central Africa, who was accused of war crimes at the time, and you were wondering even whether to say, it was nice to meet him given the given the things that he'd done. So what was the most sort of memorable or hair-raising thing that happened or that you did whilst you were researching for the book?
Yeah, honestly, there were many instances where I was sort of wondering, You know, like how, like, do you know that meme? Like, how did you're probably wondering how I ended up here? It's
Mm.
like kind of,
Yeah,
it's
yeah, I
like
can
that. It's like,
imagine.
where did I sort of go wrong to not like be in this situation? But yeah, I mean, talking to that man was definitely difficult because it's an unusual interaction. But I think one of the most memorable interactions that I've had was with a coup plotter, actually. So he was a Gambian American, and he was in the States. He was a peaceful activist, like trying to sort of mobilize people against the Gambian regime on Facebook and so forth. So very peaceful man. Not at all the type of seasoned guerrilla fighter that we were talking about earlier. And then at some point, when things got so bad in the Gambia and people were just, getting tortured, getting shot, and so forth, he decided that he couldn't go on the way that he had. He just decided, look, like peaceful protest, peaceful organizing is not going to do it. This is not going to work. And at some point, somebody who used to work for the dictator in the Gambia approached him and said, look, we need to overthrow him, with force if need be. And he thought about it for a while, and then eventually he decided to join in. So this man, peaceful activist, yeah, probably has never even held a gun, suddenly became a coup plotter.
Oof.
And then he had this sort of absurd situation where he's working a regular job, doing construction, and then sometimes during the breaks he would then plan out this coup on another continent. And they would have regular conference calls, and obviously you can't tell your family, look, like I'm going to need 2 hours, like I gotta plot this coup. Right? So they had to like figure out like how to deal with their families and so forth. And it sounds kind of funny, but it became very serious. I mean, he started buying weapons, and then they shipped them in barrels across the Atlantic to the Gambia. He himself couldn't go because he was also already like known to the regime, so he couldn't like participate in it himself. But they actually went through with it. They attempted the coup. Unfortunately, it failed. Some of the people that he had known were killed during the coup attempt. But so this was a totally normal person that got driven to do something extreme. And then, even though he didn't get killed, he also had to pay for it because the FBI ended up raiding his house, and he had to go to jail because, well, I mean, yeah, he was engaged in essentially arms trafficking.
Mm.
So yeah, so he had to go to jail. But the story has something of a happy ending because that dictator has now fallen. He got toppled by a regional coalition. So things in the Gambia did get better, although perhaps not directly through the coup attempt.
Yeah, but it's insights like that that are absolutely fascinating and sprinkled sort of throughout your book. Well, sadly, that's all we have time for on this episode of Zeitgeist. Hopefully, we've provided everyone with a tantalizing insight into your brilliant book, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, which is out on the 18th of July, 2024. Also, check out Marcel's blog, The 100, which basically has, on each article, has 3 experts answering an important question in just 100 words. So if you basically want 3 very clever people giving you a really brief insight into a topic, it's a brilliant place to go. Highly recommended. Thank you so much for coming on the Zeitgeist podcast, Marcel Dirsus.
Thank you very much.
And if you've enjoyed this episode of the Zeitgeist podcast, check out my accompanying blog, also called Zeitgeist, on katjahoyer.uk. If you've missed the previous episodes, do take a look. I've spoken to James May about German cars and the East German journalist Sabine Rennerfanz on growing up in the GDR most recently. See you next time. So long and auf Wiedersehen.